out what's necessary to maintain its safety and its basic use of military power to protect itself. I believe that's actually what people have a problem with. People do not like Jews with power. It's just, for whatever reason, I think that's really the problem. I really, really don't think that for most people, the problem is Netanyahu. For me, it is. And I've written many columns criticizing various of his policies.
Hmm.
But I think that will become increasingly clear, and then I hope the conversation will become more clear about what their real problem is.
Yeah, and the justification for the state of Israel only becomes more salient when you consider what's happening for Jews in Western Europe now. How do you view the prospect of living as a Jew in Europe and in a country like France these days?
I think it was in maybe 2014 that Jeff Goldberg wrote that cover story in The Atlantic about the Jewish experience in Europe being over. I think that was 5 years ago now, maybe longer. Personally, if I were living as a Jew in Paris and living as a publicly visible Jew meant that I couldn't wear a Jewish star in public without fear, meant that, I was talking to Mark Weissman, or I think it was in an interview actually with him, but he's an excellent French Jewish writer, wrote a recent book called Hate about anti-Semitism in France. That's really great. And he told me that when he's on the metro in Paris and he's reading a book with a Jewish theme or a Jewish cover or the word Jew in the title or Israel, he hides it. To me, that would not be an acceptable level of compromise. And for that reason, if you talk to most Jews in France, they have, their second apartment if they can afford it in Tel Aviv or Jerusalem. That's just the reality. And when you talk to people who are similarly, connected or proud of their Jewish identity in London, and you talk to them honestly about what they would do if Jeremy Corbyn were to become prime minister, each one of them has a plan for leaving.
Yeah, I mean, there are details that one hears that are pretty shocking that capture the slow encroach of something pretty ugly. I mean, so for instance, I remember hearing a few years ago, I forget who said this, but this was on a woman from France, I believe she was a journalist, said this on a panel she was on with Douglas Murray and Maajid Nawaz, and she said, for instance, you can't open a Jewish school in Paris anymore because no one will insure it. Right? You literally can't get insurance for such a school. And that's just, we're talking about one of the capitals of Europe that can't maintain the social order enough where people feel safe opening a Jewish school. These are invisible losses that until you hear about them, you never suspect that they exist.
Well, one thing that I should say, and I feel really torn about this, right? Because on the one hand, when I started in the aftermath of Pittsburgh doing speeches to different Jewish communities, I would always talk about, be proud of who you are, wear a kippah in public, wear a Jewish star, don't ever hide your Jewish identity. And the more the attacks started happening in places where I have friends with children who are those kids walking around in their kippot and who are telling me, I'm very worried about my child and I'm considering telling them to put a baseball hat over their head. And I'm not talking now about ultra-Orthodox Jews, although I know them too, but I'm talking about just conservative or whatever, modern Orthodox. I realize, who am I to tell you? I want to imagine if I'm living in Paris that I would be brazen and public in my Jewish identity, but I also believe in the value of protecting life, the fundamental Jewish value of choosing life. And I just think it's a really, really hard situation because on the one hand, I really, really believe that societies that cannot protect their Jews are societies that are dying. History just shows that very clearly. And I want places like England and France to continue to be healthy democracies. And so in the interest of, in that broader interest, I want Jews to sort of wage the fight in the places where they currently live. And yet I also understand that a certain level of risk and compromise becomes untenable and not worth it. And in that case, again, I'm drawn back to thank God that there is a state of Israel that exists as a refuge for these people.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I mean, not to mention, I mean, one thing that's often overlooked is like the Ashkenazi Jews who were at the forefront of founding the state of Israel imagined themselves as being able to save the Jews of Europe. Unfortunately, it didn't happen fast enough. But the Jews they did save were the Jews of the Arab world who were living as second-class citizens. And I think one of the most interesting things that I'm certainly doing, and that I think lots of other similarly situated American Jews of Eastern European descent are learning, is like there is this whole other Jewish universe that we were not raised on. I was really raised on the Ashkenazi version of Jewish history. And now I'm learning about the Mizrahi version. And frankly, the Mizrahi Eastern version of Jewish history is the one that Israel is more a continuation of. Israel is located where it's located, and that is in the East, and it is populated by people that have much more of a visceral sense of what that means than, frankly, I do. And that's one of the things that I think has been that I'm in adulthood trying to learn a lot more about. And there are writers like, Mati Friedman's a great example, who are sort of leading the way in telling that Mizrahi story and telling the story of Israel as being fundamentally indigenous in a way that I didn't even fully grasp.
That's interesting. Yeah, no, I spent no time thinking about that distinction either, and it seems important.
It's like we were raised, or I was raised on the idea that Israel's kind of almost like a mini Western liberal outpost in the Middle East, and it's exactly like America. But it's not. It's different in some fundamental ways. It shares many values with us, thank God. It's still, broadly speaking, I would say a liberal democracy, but it is also very much of the Arab world, and I think it's important to integrate that reality in a way that I hadn't, frankly, into the past few years when I started immersing myself more in it.
Yeah, yeah. Well, Barry, I know your time is running short. I just wish you the best of luck with this book, and thank you for coming on the podcast.
Thank you, Sam.
Okay. Well, that was great. Barry is very, very clear on this topic, and the fact that she's such a controversial figure says something not about her, but about the ocean of misinformation that we are all swimming in at the moment. And speaking of that ocean, I had a recent experience on Twitter that was instructive, very much on this point. I happened to see a very moving and disturbing documentary on the Holocaust and the current rise of anti-Semitism, especially in Western Europe. And I tweeted about it to recommend that people see it. It came out on Amazon on October 23rd, so it's available there now. The title is Never Again Is Now, and it is well worth watching. It's a very personal story that opens up into a fairly grim look at the state of things in Europe, to some degree in the U.S., but mostly focused on Europe, and mostly on Western Europe. So I tweeted about this, and I tend not to look at what's coming back at me on Twitter these days, for good reason, but I happened to look at this just because I wanted to see the reaction to the trailer to this film, and I see that someone has tweeted at me, I thought it was just the, quote, fringe of the fringe who believe this kind of thing. Right, and I see that this person is an anthropologist. And if you spend enough time on this podcast, you know at once that this is a snide tweet because, I have said that I consider anti-Semitism in the U.S. and white supremacy generally in the U.S. to be a fringe phenomenon. Again, that could change. So I don't know why I bothered to wade in here. These impulses are genuinely mysterious. So to clarify things, I responded, the problem of anti-Semitism in Europe is mostly coming from the Muslim community and the far left. It is still a fringe phenomenon in the U.S., though that could change. And this tweet elicited pure contempt and hatred from people who have real reputations. I saw at least one journalist among them. So I ventured one more tweet to clarify what could have been considered an error on my part. I said Europe, right, where in truth I meant Western Europe. Now, Europe is also used a lot in this film, and mostly it is a story of Western Europe when you're talking about the effect of Muslim anti-Semitism in Europe. So that was worth clarifying. So I wrote, well, this got a fairly crazy response. Perhaps one point of clarification is in order. The film is about the rise of anti-Semitism in Western Europe, but somehow I don't think the people responding here will care about that clarification. And indeed they didn't. This is the kind of experience that really shuts people down. People leave Twitter. In fact, there was clearly a movement to get me kicked off Twitter in response to this tweet. I got a warning from Twitter saying that your account is under review. Though no action will be taken at this time. Granted, this kind of thing is pretty boring, but it's no less consequential. And this is a third rail which I touched, which many people decline to touch for good reason, because what comes back to you is accusations of bigotry and ignorance, even from people who should know better. I would say from people who, in many cases, do know better and are just smearing you in bad faith. But for anyone who wants to look, there have been several studies characterizing anti-Semitism where when people report being victims of anti-Semitic hate crime, they are then asked to characterize where it came from. And a certain percentage can't say, but others can say it seems to have come from right-wingers or left-wingers or Muslims. The victims of these attacks report on the nature of the attack. And there are multiple studies like this, and the majority of these attacks are coming, as I said, from Muslims and the far left. And some people responded with some of these references in the Twitter storm. Anyway, this is not a surprise, and it's not bigotry against Muslims to say this. Anti-Semitism is endemic to the faith. It would be a miracle if anti-Semitism was not an extraordinarily common attitude throughout the Muslim world. One must be ignorant of the actual doctrine to escape being anti-Semitic if you're a Muslim. Or you have to have found a 21st century ethical, humanistic reason to overlook the doctrine, as no doubt many modern Muslims have. But for anyone to pretend to be confused about this is an intellectual and ethical scandal at this point. This is also the day on which it was reported that Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi was killed by U.S. Special Operations Forces. And the kinds of people who are attacking me on Twitter are the kinds of people who must think that Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi didn't understand Islam, right? And that ISIS had nothing to do with its actual doctrine. The ante to have a conversation about the real world at this point is to acknowledge that ideas matter. Granted, there are some exceptions. No doubt there's some distance between what people profess to believe and what they actually believe, what they can be motivated to risk their lives to defend. We can acknowledge all these gradations of certainty and candor. But all I can say is that the experience of touching this topic is to be confronted again and again by people's seemingly boundless capacity for self-deception and bad faith. And that's not a pretty picture. There's no mystery as to why most people don't want to spend much time looking at it. And on that happy note, I will leave you until next time. If you find this podcast valuable, there are many ways you can support it. You can review it on iTunes or Stitcher or wherever you happen to listen to it. You can share it on social media with your friends. You can blog about it or discuss it on your own podcast, or you can support it directly. And you can do this by subscribing through my website at samharris.org. And there you'll find subscriber-only content, like my Ask Me Anything episodes, as well as the bonus questions from many of these interviews. You'll also get advance tickets to my live events. You'll find all of these things and more at samharris.org. And thank you for supporting the show. Listeners like you make it possible.